for 5 minutes, and I strongly support Congressman Fulcher's bill, H.R. 4141, which does streamline the federal permitting process for broadband projects. This legislation is part of a broader effort by House Republicans to close the digital divide for communities in rural America. And I know this really, I think, got off the ground back in the 2018 Farm Bill, and I saw benefits in my district where rural area electric cooperatives were able to work and install high-speed broadband lines out to the last mile. And some of those last miles in rural America are several last miles that you've got to go through to actually get to these homes. As we've discussed, it's important on both sides of the aisle that we get broadband to every American. It affects every aspect of life, from work, education, healthcare, and even conveniences like online shopping. And it's easy for those with access to high-speed broadband to take this important tool for granted. Yet the reality is there are still roughly 42 million Americans that do not have the same access. This digital divide is hurting our rural and tribal communities especially hard. Roughly 17% of Americans in rural communities and 18% of Americans living on tribal lands do not have access to broadband. The negative impacts of the digital divide have become even more apparent in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, when many Americans were forced to work and participate in school from their homes. Thankfully, the need for broadband among our committee members has declined now that we've returned to in-person hearings and markups. However, for many Americans, access to broadband remains a necessary requirement for everyday life. There are billions of dollars out there to invest in broadband, but that doesn't mean we should be wasteful in the way that broadband's being spent. Spending that money without addressing our burdensome regulatory processes will ultimately lead to a significant waste of taxpayer funds while projects continue to languish. Two of the main obstacles hampering large-scale broadband infrastructure deployment are lengthy reviews and permitting costs created by laws like NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act. Across the country, it takes 4.5 years to complete an environmental review for an average project. For wireless projects, this is a statistic I find very alarming. For wireless projects, nearly a third of the total cost goes directly towards the completion of federal reviews. For example, it takes about an hour to install a small broadband cell the size of a pizza box to an existing street light or utility pole, but it can take developers over a year to get the federal permits necessary for the installation. In many cases, broadband infrastructure is being deployed in existing rights-of-ways or easements where communications and utility infrastructure already exist. Requiring environmental reviews in areas that have already undergone that process is unnecessary and duplicative. These reviews offer no tangible benefit and only serve to add significant cost and lengthy delays. H.R. 4141 would speed up this process and lower cost by exempting broadband deployments over previously disturbed lands from NEPA and National Historic Preservation Act reviews. I can say in the rural part of Arkansas where I live, they're finally running fiber optics cable down the right-of-way that's been there for decades before I moved to this area. And it's it's a rural utility pole with a couple of electric wires on it, and they're running a third wire on the poles. That's the fiber optic line. And to think that they had to go through a lengthy environmental review process to put another line on these poles in this right-of-way that's been there forever is really absurd. And I know people are excited that they may be getting broadband eventually, but they would also be appalled to know how long it took to get those right-of-ways approved or those attachments approved. The bill enhances tribal review processes and establishes a streamlined process for moving forward with certain projects. It's focused, again, on reducing redundant environmental reviews on previously disturbed lands. It's a good bill that will cut unnecessary red tape and expedite efforts to provide high-speed broadband to all Americans. I want to applaud Congressman Fulcher for his leadership on this effort. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and I yield back my time. I now ask unanimous consent following letter of support for H.R. 4141 be added to the record for today's hearing. This letter is from the NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, and the letter states in part that H.R. 4141 would, quote, "It contains proactive measures aimed at streamlining, permitting, and helping deliver on universal broadband connectivity. As federally funded broadband deployment ramps up even further in the coming years, it is imperative that permitting reform for wired and wireless networks alike be at the forefront of this discussion. We encourage Congress to help address such concerns by moving forward with streamlining measures like H.R. 4141, end quote. Without objection, so ordered. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 4141, and I recognize the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for the purpose of offering his amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Fulcher 12 A&S. Without objection, the amendment is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Mr. Fulcher, you're recognized. Mr. Fulcher, did you have any discussion on your amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I think I'm missing that section. I'm going to have to come back to you. Please forgive me here.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment in nature of a substitute? I support Mr. Fulcher's A&S to H.R. 4141. The A&S adds a short title naming the bill Broadband for Americans Through Responsible Streamlining Act, or the BARS Act. Everybody knows that no good piece of legislation is complete without a catchy acronym, and this one is appropriate because it's exactly what the bill does. It responsibly streamlines inefficient and outdated permitting processes that are making it difficult for us to close the digital divide in rural America. I'd again like to thank Congressman Fulcher for leading this effort, which will benefit folks from Arkansas to Idaho and every state in between, even Arizona and New Mexico. And I urge my colleagues to support the A&S and the underlying legislation. I yield back my time.